What's really happening with Iran's war against America and Israel? 3 weeks into the largest military confrontation the Middle East has seen in decades, something strange is emerging from the chaos. The United States has struck over 6,000 targets. Israel has eliminated more than 380 Hezbollah fighters. The American Navy has sunk or destroyed over 90 Iranian vessels. Iranian drone attacks have collapsed by 95%. And yet, Iran's supreme leader Mustafa Khamenei stands before cameras in Tehran, declaring victory. Oil prices are spiking globally. American public support for this war has fallen below 40%. And the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil flows, is now effectively closed. So who is actually winning this war? The answer reveals something fundamental about how modern conflicts are fought, measured, and ultimately decided. Because in this war, the side with overwhelming military superiority may be losing the only battle that truly matters. Let's establish what we actually know as of mid-March 2026. Operation Roaring Lion and Operation Epic Fury began around February 28th, when American and Israeli forces launched coordinated strikes against Iranian military installations, nuclear facilities, and critical infrastructure. This wasn't a surprise attack in the traditional sense. Tensions had been building for months, and UN Security Council debates had already exposed the fault lines. Columbia University economist Jeffrey Sachs had sent an open letter to the Security Council calling American threats against Iran violations of international law. The diplomatic space for de-escalation had collapsed. What followed was the most intensive air campaign against a nation-state since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. American forces struck Karg Island, the critical oil terminal through which over 90% of Iranian oil exports flow. The Israeli Defense Forces conducted what they describe as thousands of strikes against both Iranian targets and Hezbollah positions in Lebanon. On March 13th alone, Israeli strikes on southern Lebanon's coast killed 8 people. The combined U.S.-Israeli air power has demonstrated what military analysts call absolute domain supremacy, the ability to strike anywhere, at any time, with near total impunity. By the numbers, this looks like a decisive victory in progress. 6,000 targets destroyed, 90 vessels eliminated, a 95% reduction in drone attacks. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth described Iranian military operations as showing sheer desperation. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz declared the war has entered its decisive stretch. But here's where the picture gets complicated. On March 14th, the Pentagon announced the deployment of 2,000 to 2,500 additional Marines to the Persian Gulf, along with additional naval assets. This isn't a victory lap. This is escalation. And it signals something the official statements aren't saying directly. The air campaign alone isn't achieving its strategic objectives. Think about what that deployment means. If bombing 6,000 targets and sinking 90 ships had broken Iranian resistance, you don't send more ground forces. You begin drawdown planning. You transition to post-conflict operations. Instead, American military planners are positioning assets for a potential ground engagement, either against Iranian forces directly or to secure the Strait of Hormuz. Simultaneously, Israeli military leadership is preparing what sources describe as a potential ground operation into Lebanon against Hezbollah positions. The IDF has killed over 380 Hezbollah fighters in 2 weeks, but the missile attacks on Israeli cities haven't stopped. Air raid sirens continue to sound across Israel, from the northern border communities to Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to Eilat in the far south. This reveals the fundamental asymmetry of this conflict. The United States and Israel can destroy almost anything Iran possesses. They've proven this comprehensively. But Iran isn't trying to win by protecting its military assets. It's trying to win by imposing costs that America and Israel cannot sustain. To understand this strategy, you need to examine the 3 dimensions of this war: military, economic, and political. Militarily, there's no contest. The combined firepower of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the Israeli Air Force, and American strategic bombers outmatches Iranian capabilities by orders of magnitude. Iran's Air Force is largely obsolete. Its navy has been decimated. Its air defense systems have proven unable to prevent systematic strikes against even hardened targets. But military superiority only matters if it achieves strategic objectives. And Iran's strategic objective isn't to defeat the American military. That was never possible. Iran's objective is to make this war so costly, so disruptive, and so unpopular that political pressure forces a settlement on terms Tehran can accept. This is where the economic dimension becomes critical. When Supreme Leader Mustafa Khamenei announced Iran would block oil exports through the Persian Gulf, he wasn't making a desperate threat. He was activating Iran's actual weapon in this conflict, its geographic position. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Every day, roughly 21 million barrels of oil pass through this choke point. That's nearly 20% of global petroleum consumption. Iran doesn't need to win air battles to affect this flow. It needs only to create sufficient uncertainty, mine sufficient waters, and threaten sufficient tankers to disrupt global energy markets. And it's working. Despite emergency releases from strategic petroleum reserves across multiple countries, oil prices have spiked dramatically. The situation became severe enough that on March 13th, the United States took an extraordinary step, easing sanctions on Russian oil exports for 30 days to increase global supply and moderate prices. Consider what that means. America is fighting a war against Iran while simultaneously relaxing pressure on Russia, Iran's primary military supplier and diplomatic defender, because Iranian actions have disrupted energy markets so severely. Russia, notably, was the only permanent Security Council member to block a recent UN resolution condemning Iran. That resolution attracted 140 co-sponsors, including Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan, essentially the entire Arab Gulf establishment united against Iranian aggression. But Russia blocked it, maintaining its strategic partnership with Tehran even as that partnership complicates American attempts to negotiate over Ukraine. This is the hidden architecture of global power in 2026. Everything connects to everything else. The political dimension may ultimately prove decisive. American public support for this war has dropped below 40%, and we're only 3 weeks in. This isn't Vietnam. This isn't Afghanistan. This is happening at a pace that should alarm strategic planners in Washington. The casualties help explain this. On March 13th alone, the Pentagon acknowledged 6 additional American service members killed. We don't have comprehensive casualty figures across the first 3 weeks, but the trajectory is clear. Americans are dying, and the public's tolerance for those deaths is eroding faster than military objectives are being achieved. Defense Minister Israel Katz's statement that this war will continue as needed suggests Israeli leadership understands they may be in for a prolonged conflict. But Israel's domestic political situation is different from America's. Israeli society has experience with extended military operations. American society, particularly in 2026, does not. Jeffrey Sachs's criticism from Columbia University reflects a broader intellectual current. The argument that this is an unprovoked war of choice that abandoned diplomatic alternatives like the nuclear deal framework. Whether or not you agree with that assessment, it represents a narrative that opponents of the war will use to accelerate public opposition. Iran is betting that American political will breaks before Iranian strategic capacity does. Now let me tell you what most people don't understand about this conflict. The headline story is missiles and airstrikes. The real story is something far less dramatic but far more consequential: the systematic degradation of Iran's proxy warfare capability. When military analysts describe a 95% reduction in Iranian drone attacks, they're not just describing successful air defense. They're describing the collapse of an operational capability that took Iran decades to develop. Iran's strategic model since the 1979 revolution has been what military planners call forward defense, fighting adversaries through proxies and asymmetric capabilities far from Iranian territory. Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militia groups in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. This network allowed Iran to project power across the region while maintaining plausible deniability and avoiding direct confrontation with superior military forces. What's happening in March 2026 is the systematic dismantling of that network. 380 Hezbollah fighters eliminated in 2 weeks. The drone manufacturing and deployment capability that made Iran's proxies so dangerous has been reduced by 95%. The logistics networks, training facilities, and command structures that connected Tehran to its regional assets are being systematically destroyed. This doesn't make headlines like missile strikes on Tel Aviv, but it represents a strategic shift that will shape Middle Eastern security for decades. The question is whether this degradation happens fast enough to affect the current conflict, or whether it's a long-term victory purchased at the cost of a short-term political defeat. There's another hidden factor that deserves attention: the Karg Island strike and what it means for Iran's long-term position. Karg Island isn't just an oil terminal, it's the financial lifeline of the Iranian state. More than 90% of Iran's oil exports flow through this facility. By striking it, American forces didn't just damage military infrastructure, they attacked the economic foundation of the Iranian government. This creates a paradox for Tehran. If the war ends quickly, Iran will emerge with its primary revenue source crippled, its military capabilities degraded, and its proxy networks decimated. The cost of rebuilding could take a decade. The strategic position Iran spent 40 years constructing would be largely destroyed. But if Iran can prolong the war, if it can maintain the Strait of Hormuz disruption, keep oil prices elevated, and erode American political support, it might force a negotiated settlement that provides relief from the damage already inflicted. This is why Mushaba Kami's defiant rhetoric isn't just propaganda for domestic consumption. It's a strategic signal that Iran intends to absorb punishment rather than capitulate quickly. The supreme leader understands that time is both his enemy and his ally. Every day, Iranian military capacity degrades, but every day, American political support also erodes. The race is to determine which collapse comes first. What does this mean for you, wherever you're watching from? First, understand the economic implications. The Strait of Hormuz disruption affects energy prices globally. Even if you live nowhere near the Middle East, you're paying for this war every time you fill your gas tank or pay your electricity bill. The 30-day relaxation of Russian sanctions is a temporary measure that won't fundamentally alter supply constraints. Watch for continued price volatility in petroleum products through at least the second quarter of 2026. Second, track the defense sector carefully. Major defense contractors are seeing increased activity, but the pattern differs from previous conflicts. The emphasis on precision strike capabilities, naval warfare systems, and drone defense suggests where procurement priorities are heading. Companies with strong positions in these areas are likely to see sustained demand regardless of how this specific conflict resolves. Third, monitor the shipping and logistics sectors. Insurance rates for Persian Gulf transit have increased dramatically. Some carriers are rerouting around Africa rather than risk the Strait of Hormuz. This adds time and cost to supply chains that were already strained. Consumer goods dependent on Asian manufacturing may see price increases or availability issues in the coming months. Fourth, pay attention to gold and other safe haven assets. Geopolitical uncertainty typically drives investors toward perceived safety. This conflict, combined with ongoing tensions elsewhere, creates an environment where traditional safe havens may outperform despite higher interest rate environments. Finally, understand the framework for evaluating similar situations in the future. The key metric isn't military victory or defeat. It's the relationship between strategic objectives and political sustainability. A campaign can achieve every tactical goal and still fail if the domestic population loses support before those victories translate into strategic outcomes. Looking forward, 3 scenarios deserve consideration. The most likely outcome, perhaps 40 to 45% probability, is a prolonged stalemate lasting through summer 2026. American and Israeli forces continue degrading Iranian capabilities while Iran continues disrupting oil flows and imposing costs. Neither side achieves decisive victory. Eventually, exhaustion and economic pressure force negotiations, likely mediated by parties like China or India, who maintain relationships with both sides. This scenario produces the most uncertainty for markets and global stability. The second scenario, approximately 30% probability, involves escalation rather than resolution. The Marine deployment signals potential ground operations. Israel's preparation for Lebanon invasion suggests willingness to open a second front. If ground forces engage directly with Iranian Revolutionary Guards or a full-scale Lebanon war erupts, casualty rates increase dramatically on all sides. This scenario carries the highest risk of regional conflagration, potentially drawing in additional actors. Oil prices in this scenario could spike to levels not seen since the 1970s. The third scenario, perhaps 20 to 25% probability, is a relatively rapid Iranian capitulation. If the combined pressure of military strikes, economic strangulation from the Karg Island damage, and internal unrest within Iran creates conditions for regime change or fundamental policy reversal, the conflict could end more quickly than current trajectories suggest. However, the defiant rhetoric from Iranian leadership and continued missile operations make this scenario less likely with each passing day. What markers should you watch in the next 90 days? First, American casualty rates. If the 6 deaths on March 13th represent an anomaly, political pressure may stabilize. If they represent a new baseline, expect accelerating public opposition. Second, Hezbollah missile cadence. The 380 fighters killed represent significant attrition. If missile attacks on Israeli cities decrease substantially, it signals successful degradation of launch capability. If they continue at current rates despite losses, it suggests deeper stockpiles and more resilient networks than intelligence assessments indicated. Third, oil prices and tanker traffic. The ultimate measure of Strait of Hormuz disruption is whether ships are willing to transit and at what insurance costs. Watch for major shipping companies announcing Red Sea alternatives or insurance markets pricing in sustained risk. Fourth, diplomatic activity. The 140 co-sponsors of the UN resolution represent an unprecedented coalition against Iranian regional behavior. If Russia maintains its blocking position while China remains neutral, the diplomatic space for resolution narrows. Watch for any Chinese mediation initiatives. Beijing has strong interests in both energy stability and regional influence. Fifth, Israeli ground operations. If the IDF launches a significant ground campaign into Lebanon, the conflict fundamentally transforms from an air and missile exchange into something more closely resembling conventional warfare. This raises stakes for all parties and likely extends the timeline for any resolution. Return to our original question. Is Iran actually winning against America and Israel? By any conventional military measure, no. Iran is suffering catastrophic losses to its military infrastructure, its proxy networks, and its economic capacity. The disparity in capabilities has been demonstrated decisively, but wars aren't won by military measures alone. Iran's strategy was never to defeat American carrier groups or outfly Israeli jets. Iran's strategy is to impose costs, human, financial, and political, that exceed what American and Israeli publics will tolerate. To make the continuation of this war more painful than its termination. 3 weeks in, that strategy is working better than anyone in Washington or Tel Aviv expected. American public support below 40%. Oil prices spiking despite emergency measures. Sanctions on Russia eased to manage energy markets. Marines deploying to the Gulf because air power alone isn't achieving objectives. Israeli cities under persistent missile attack despite hundreds of enemy fighters eliminated. The United States is winning every battle and may be losing the war. This is the paradox of asymmetric conflict in the 21st century. Superior firepower creates superior destruction. But destruction isn't the same as victory. Victory requires achieving political objectives at sustainable cost. And right now, neither side is close to achieving that. What happens in the next 30 to 60 days will likely determine whether this becomes a swift campaign with lasting strategic implications or a prolonged quagmire that reshapes Middle Eastern politics for a generation. The missiles will continue falling. The drones will continue flying. The ships will continue sailing toward contested waters. But the real battle is happening in living rooms and legislatures, in polling data and commodity markets, in the invisible calculus of how much each society will sacrifice for objectives that grow more uncertain with every passing day. That's the war within the war. And that's what will ultimately determine who wins.